I'm here with Dr. Brian Green, who is the Director of Technology Ethics at Markkula Center of Applied Ethics. Hi, Dr. Green. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm very excited to talk.
So, do you think that human beings have a duty to explore space?
I think that's a great question. I think that we definitely have good reasons to explore space, is the way I would describe it. I think that phrasing it as a duty is kind of an interesting question because it means that all the people in the past weren't able to do it, right? And I don't want to say that they were neglecting their duty by not doing that in the past, but I think that now that we have the capability, it's become important for us to pursue this exploration of space and also potentially all the way to settlement in space.
Okay, let me rephrase it. Given that we have the technology to explore space, are we doing something wrong by not exploring space?
So that's a good way to phrase it. I think that we should be exploring space. So I think that by putting the word should in there, yes, there's an ethical aspect to it.
Yeah, okay. And so, assuming that you think that we should, explain to me why you think we have the right to. And let me put this in
Mhm.
context. A lot of people, I think, would think that we are not treating the earth very well. Do we have a right to go and explore other places to settle?
So that's a really interesting question, and it's certainly something that comes up. People say if we go to other planets, we're just going to mess them up like we've messed up the Earth. But I have a different perspective on that, which is that I think that if we go to these other planets, we will actually come to appreciate the Earth a lot more because the moon is just a barren vacuum wasteland, right? And I can't remember which of the first two astronauts set foot on the moon. And they said magnificent desolation. It's amazing, but it's also completely desolate. And when you look back at the Earth, you all of a sudden realize the Earth has everything that we want. It's such a beautiful, perfect planet in so many ways. And I think that one of my colleagues, Jim Schwartz, who also does space ethics, he used the phrase super environmental ethic, that if you have to go to the moon or Mars and set up your own environment and all those sorts of things just inside a space habitation area, you all of a sudden become very aware of the environment that you're in. And so you learn to take care of it a lot more. And a lot of those technologies that will be developed for that sort of habitation in space will be useful for coming back to Earth and making better recycling, better water recycling, better care of the air, and those sorts of things.
So is our ability through our new technology to explore space only for future persons and future environments? Or I guess my question is, who are we exploring space for?
Mhm.
Is it for us now, or is it all future oriented, or who's affected? Who would be positively or negatively affected by this space exploration?
So I think it's important for us now. That's absolutely something that's important. I mean, you can think about there have been all sorts of technologies that have been really pioneered by space exploration. For example, solar energy collection, photovoltaic cells. All those solar panels were very much, in a lot of ways, were promoted by satellites and putting satellites in orbit, for example. And so this green technology is having wonderful benefits for us here on Earth, right now. And so it's important for us to explore these sorts of technologies. I have a friend who's an engineer, and he says engineers love designing for borderline cases because it lets you push the technology out where it's never been used before. And then we realize this actually could be really useful for us right now under normal circumstances. So it's beneficial not only to future people, but also to people right now.
Okay, well, assume you're right. Sounds like something we really, really should do. Who is responsible for funding this kind of exploration?
Yeah, that I think the question there is who. Yeah, the who's going to pay for it question is a very important question, and I think what it should be is it's because it's benefiting. Um, Ultimately, it benefits all humankind. Is one thing that I would say. Right now, we've seen a lot of billionaires going into space, for example, and everyone says whatever they can fly away. We don't want them anyway. but I think it's much more important than that, because once again, when you're pushing technology forward, of course, at the start, it's very expensive because it's never been done before. But the price starts to come down. It starts to have benefits for everyone, so that we have solar cells now in, most remote places on Earth, whether it is in a village in a remote part of Africa, or whether it is in other places on Earth. And so these technologies become very beneficial to us, and we, over time, this makes it clear to us that this is beneficial not only for billionaires, it's beneficial to all of the people on Earth. And so because of that, because it's beneficial to everyone, in some ways, everyone should pay for it. Now, obviously, some people can pay more than others. And so if the billionaires want to spend their money on it, that's perfect, right? They'll spend their money. They have the money to spend. It's not going to cost people who are impoverished in remote parts of the world. So ideally, everyone pays for it. Of course, if you have more money, then it makes sense for you to pay more. And because in the end, the benefits will come back to everyone.
But if you're right, Dr. Green, it's not just the human species. If you're right, if we explore space and we realize how much better Earth is, we might take better care of it. It benefits the water here, the Earth here, all the ecosystems, all of the species, including humans. Humans would be just one piece of the benefited parties. So, assuming you're right, is it something like every human being should do this, not only for themselves and future human species, but for all the natural resources, for all of the wildlife? So it would be like a global project. Anyone with something to provide should fund. Is it that extreme?
So I'm not sure it's that extreme. I think there are obviously some places on Earth where poverty is an extremely important problem to be solving, or we're dealing with a pandemic right now. We have emergency situations that come up all the time in various places around the Earth. If you have an emergency, you need to deal with the emergency now, because otherwise you don't get to the future. So we are in a crisis on Earth right now. We have a lot of emergencies going on. Whether it's with climate change or pollution or with the pandemic or all these other, bad things that are happening. We need to address those, but I think that there's a small fraction of that attention which also really needs to be directed towards the future and thinking big picture and long term. And that big picture, long term thinking always comes back to benefit, just regular people ultimately, and helps make the Earth a better place.
Okay, thanks. So do you think that it makes any difference whether we as a species are exploring space nationally, like say America versus Russia, or exploring space as a United Nations, or exploring space privately versus publicly funded programs? Does it make any difference who gets together and tries to go out there?
So this is a really important question, because the international relations aspect of space has always been a huge issue. It's the reason the United States got to the moon before the Soviet Union, for example. It was this race, right? Who's better? Who has the better political and economic system? Is it the Soviet Union or is it the United States? And so when the United States won that race, all of a sudden the interest in space kind of died off. People weren't that interested in it anymore, and so there was this kind of a long, probably 30 years, 40 years almost, where it was just the space shuttle was going up into low Earth orbit. And of course, we haven't, nobody's been back to the moon in over 50 years. So these sorts of issues become really important to recognize and to deal with. And I think that that race element of it can be provocative, it can be useful, it can be helpful for making sure that things actually happen. But I think we need to make sure that the competition also has a cooperative aspect to it, which is to recognize that it's not just the United States, and it's not just Russia, and it's not just China or the European Space Agency. We're all in this together in a certain extent. And there are certain international treaties like the Outer Space Treaty that specifically says if one country is having trouble in outer space, like they need to be rescued, then all the nations of Earth should cooperate together to go rescue those people who are in danger. And so that has been actually a good point of international cooperation over decades, where there was a lot of strain on international relations, right? The cooperative aspect of space is also really important.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that. We send, I don't know, a team of astronauts on a super long mission. We're taking human beings out of their natural environment, to say the least. And we might be talking for years and years, right? How ethical is it to ask a human being to go on such a mission? Is it ethical to ask them? Is it ethical to allow them to go and be astronauts for years and years in that unnatural setting?
So that is a really important question, and it's the way I answered is it's a good thing that the people want to. There are people who want to volunteer for this, right? If nobody wanted to volunteer for this, then it would be really hard to make an ethical case for saying we're picking you and we're sending you to Mars. If there are no volunteers, then I think we get into kind of a bad situation. Um, Luckily, there are volunteers. There are actually hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people around the world who are very interested in these sorts of things. Now, it might turn out that some people are excited about it in a more abstract sense, and when they actually get sent to the moon, they're like, "I don't like it here. Send me home." That's quite possible. In which case, they should totally be brought back to Earth and brought home. So they shouldn't be forced to stay out there if they don't want to. But I think that we're lucky in that a lot of people have that curiosity. We have that openness to experience very different things, and the rest of us who might not be interested in doing that, we can be thankful to those people, right? We can say thank you for going and exploring for us.
Okay, so switching gears here, let's say that we do send a team nationally or internationally, cooperating with other countries, whatever it is. And we get to some planet on which we land, and there is extraterrestrial life. So some kind of life beyond our Earth. And tell me how you're thinking about this as you answer the question, whether it be like bacteria, definitely life, or some kind of alien looking thing that we might have seen from movies. What obligation do we have to the life that we find out there in this hypothetical scenario? Are we able to study it? Are we able to bring it back? Like, what do we owe anything we find out there?
That's a really interesting question because the first thing I think that we have to do is figure out what kind of life it is, right? Bacteria versus something very simple like bacteria or a jellyfish or something like that. Super interesting, super important. We should absolutely study it and learn more about it and protect it and those sorts of things. If it's intelligent life, then that's a whole different question. It's not likely that there's other intelligent life within the solar system, but when you look at the entire galaxy, if you look at the entire universe, all of a sudden the numbers get so big that it's likely that somewhere out there, there are other intelligent forms of life. And so they might be very distant from us. They might be very hard for us to interact with, but we should be aware of that possibility at least. Now, backing up, it's within our own solar system. It's quite possible that we could run into other life forms, bacteria, simple things, perhaps like a fungus, or like I said, a jellyfish if you're somewhere like the water under Europa, which is one of the moons of Jupiter. So somewhere like Mars is probably going to have not aquatic life forms because there's not much liquid water on Mars. There's actually a little bit of liquid water on Mars on the surface. There might be more underground, but there's probably not a lot of it. Maybe not enough to sustain evolution, for example. But if you go somewhere like Europa, like I said, one of the moons of Jupiter, it looks like Europa has an underwater or under ice. It has a shell of ice around it, and then under that, a lot of water, more water than perhaps is on the entire planet Earth. And so you have an entire ocean under there where there could be evolution. There could be all sorts of strange creatures under there that we don't know about. And so when we think about our ethical obligation towards them, then we need to talk about, well, are they related to Earth life or not? So that's kind of the first thing, because we know that, for example, pieces of Mars and Earth can go back to each other. If there's a very, very strong asteroid impact, it'll break pieces off of Mars, and those have actually landed on the Earth. We've found these Martian meteorites in Antarctica, for example. And it's quite possible for things to go the other direction too. Things could go from the Earth to Mars. And if that's the case, then it could be that Earth bacteria have already landed on Mars. naturally speaking, from these sorts of impacts. Um, Also, in terms of space exploration, the different probes and experiments and landers that we've sent to Mars could have Earth bacteria on them. Very likely there is Earth bacteria because right now the way they do this for Mars exploration is that the probes don't have to be sterile. That's too expensive. Some of the early probes were sterilized, but they're no longer sent there as a sterile robot. They are sent there with a certain amount of bacteria on them, which is not very much, but they aren't perfectly clean. And so as they drive, if you imagine the rover driving around the surface, it can leave a trail of bacteria from Earth behind it as a potential risk. And so if we go to Mars and we discover Mars is covered in Earth bacteria, then we need to ask ourselves, did we put it there or did it get there naturally? And if it's so, if and of course, all of a sudden we say if we brought it there, then we screwed up the science. We've already contaminated the planet. We don't know what we're going to find there anymore because we might have already messed it up by bringing Earth life to Mars. So that's one side of thing. The other side is what if it's a second Genesis, as Chris McKay, who's a NASA scientist, calls it. If life originated on Mars and originated there independently of Earth, that's a huge scientific discovery. That's a really big deal because it means that two planets right next to each other develop life both on their own. That probably means that there's life everywhere in the universe, which is a really interesting and fascinating discovery just in and of itself.
Okay, you use the word can, and I want to think more deeply about that. You're saying, well, we know that bacteria from Earth can exist on Mars, and we know that bacteria from Mars, or not bacteria, things, particles, pieces, mass, corporeal, physical stuff from Mars can come to Earth. So by can, you mean is physically able to, or by can, do you mean we know that Earth and Mars can swap stuff without causing problems? So are you insinuating that we don't know if we brought something back from a planet beyond our solar system, whether it can be on Earth without causing problems?
Yeah, so this is a great question. The can aspect of it is important because just because a rock can transfer between Mars and the Earth doesn't necessarily mean that it had any living things on it. So it could be that these rocks have been going back and forth, but nothing alive ever has made it from one place to the other. It doesn't survive the explosion that blasted off the planet, and it might not survive the re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, for example. So we don't know for a fact that it's possible for life to do that. We have to be very careful, actually, when we're exploring Mars in terms of bringing anything back to the Earth. Because if we discover a completely unrelated life form on Mars and bring it back to Earth and it turns out to be some horrible pathogen that's worse than COVID or something like that, then we've just made a horrible mistake.
Right. So let's back up and revisit a previous question. If we leave the solar system, leave the galaxy, go to like somewhere in the Virgo supercluster of galaxies, and there we find something that we're calling extraterrestrial life, should we bring it back or should we leave it there?
Yeah, it's when you first discover something, you need to be very careful with it, is what I would say. Anything living, living things they reproduce, right? They produce more of themselves. That's what life does. And so if you, for example, found a fantastic looking plant growing in the Virgo supercluster and you were somehow able to bring it back to Earth, and then you release the plant on Earth, it could easily take over the entire planet, right? Maybe nothing on Earth can eat it, for example. Maybe it just starts spreading everywhere. It's an invasive species, and we can never get rid of it. That would be a big problem. And who knows? Maybe it's poisonous. We can touch it, and it burns our skin or something like that with chemicals. So there are all these sorts of dangerous things that we need to think about. That story might seem extreme. It might seem kind of ridiculous, but we have to recognize that we don't know anything about space, right? There's so little that we know, and when you're dealing with huge uncertainty, then you need to be very, very careful to compensate for that, just in case there's something bad there.
Yeah, that strikes me as correct. And don't we have analogies like bringing things from other countries to America? They become invasive species. We have problems in the Midwest with Asian carp, for example. So that strikes me as that's something true. Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, you're right. It's something that we've dealt with here on Earth, and invasive species cost billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in damages that they cost. Because if those invasive species hadn't been there, then agriculture would run better. You wouldn't have to worry about, native things being driven extinct. There have been so many examples of species that have been driven extinct because of other introduced species coming in. So it really is a big ecological danger and also economic danger.
So one of the reasons you think we should explore space does not include bringing things back to Earth to study.
Not until we know that they're pretty safe. So what you can do is maybe you could set up an outer space station or something like that. You could have a bunch of Earth life on the space station. You could introduce the strange species there, the species from another planet, into that contained ecosystem and say, does this damage the life forms there? Do they get along with each other? How do they interact? And if there doesn't seem to be any problem, then I guess there's no danger associated with it. But it would take a long time and a lot of effort to make sure that it really is safe.
Well, those were all the questions that I had prepared. Is there anything while we're on these topics that you would like to add? Like anything that you didn't put in your book, Space Ethics, that you think you should add?
So I tried to make the book really comprehensive. I tried to make it cover everything. But I think that one thing that's in the book that we didn't talk about here is the fact that there are some problems coming up with space ethics right now, especially in terms of space debris and militarization of space.
Oh, tell us about it, please.
So I think it was just last month, or it was within a few weeks ago, Russia, for example, blew up one of their own satellites. They used an anti-satellite weapon to blow up one of their own satellites, and the folks in the International Space Station had to shelter in their escape capsules just in case that debris had hit the space station. Now, it's turned out now that the risk is fairly low. It looks like that's not going to be a problem, at least not for a while, because what happens is those pieces slowly come down closer and closer to the Earth, crossing the orbits of every satellite on the way down. And if they hit each other, then you get another explosion and a whole bunch more debris goes flying out. And it's possible to get something called the debris cascade, or it's called the Kessler syndrome after a guy named Kessler who came up with the idea, which is that if you start having debris explode and hitting other debris, pretty soon everything is turned into a big mess of whirling debris around the Earth and you can't go into it anymore. Everything is destroyed. So we need to be conscious of that. Luckily, at relatively lower orbits, the debris comes down faster. But if you get above a certain level, it can be there for 10,000 years. And so this is a problem that's happening right now in space that we need to solve, or else we could actually prevent ourselves from being able to explore space in the future.
So, are there any kind of global committees working on this with every nation? Or how do we even have that conversation with everyone who's doing anything above the atmosphere? Like, what's going on with this?
So there are organizations who are tasked with working on this. They tend to be very underfunded. They tend to be ignored a lot of the time. So they can either be part of the United Nations, or they're independent groups, or there are certain groups, of course, within countries themselves. But I think what we need to recognize now is that this is truly a global problem, right? If space debris, if the orbital space around the Earth becomes completely filled with debris, that's a problem that's literally bigger than the planet. That's an environmental disaster bigger than the planet Earth. And we thought we already had big problems, right? So this is a big problem that has to be solved. We need to put the right amount of attention on it. If something is so dangerous, we need to give it more attention so that we really prevent that from happening.